Jamal's topic today is the politics of oil prices, something that should be of great interest to a lot of us. He had a very clever title for the speech that we somehow didn't work into the publicity, Hegemons or Hedge Funds, who's behind the rise in oil prices. So we're all actually very anxious to hear the answer to that question, so let's welcome Mr. Qureshi with us today.
I have to say, when they asked that they cover the topic of politics and oil prices, this is really a huge topic. I mean, we spend days and days talking about a single country with clients sometimes, and trying to sum up all the politics and oil obviously isn't possible just in a half hour to an hour. So what I've tried to do is strike a bit of a balance. Hopefully I've succeeded in covering a lot of the key issues and bringing out some interesting stories in the middle of it. Undoubtedly there'll be some things we miss, but hopefully this will give you a toolbox to try and understand what's going on in oil markets and how politics interact with that. The way I organize this is before we even get into the intersection of oil and politics, it's important to understand what oil is, how the market for oil works, what the physical properties of oil are. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that first, because that's a foundation that will allow you to understand when you hear headlines what's really going on and where things fit in the big picture. This is actually a big problem. When it comes to oil, everybody out there, it seems like, feels they have a need to talk about it. I mean, people are involved in lots of different professions. You hear doctors, all they want to talk about is medicine. You hear engineers, they just want to talk about engineering. Oil's a funny thing in that it covers a broad range of fields, and it has a huge impact on all of our daily lives, and on politics, on economics, such that it crosses boundaries. And it's the sort of topic that really can have the sort of impact that people think it does, even if it's not always in the way people think. And that's kind of the problem here. Most people see only a small part of the story. We're like blind men trying to feel the elephant, like the old metaphor goes. You see one little thing, you hear something about a pipeline blowing up, or about a refinery having trouble, or the debate about Anwar in Alaska and the oil reserves up there. And everybody will put out these big arguments that seem to make sense in both directions sometimes, but nobody, it seems like, at least nobody in the policy-making community, very few people in the media, there's very few people who actually understand how all these pieces fit together. So my goal today is to try and give you some tools to try and understand that big picture, so that the next time you hear a headline, you'll be able to have some sense of where that really fits. Does this really matter? Does it not? Are they giving the right spin to this, or are they not? The place to start for this is first understanding why oil is so important. What do we use oil for? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that oil is the single largest piece of energy that we consume in the world. Coal is the second closest, and it's substantially beneath the use of oil we have. Oil is used overwhelmingly for transportation purposes. We used to use it a lot more for heating and things like this, but now more it's going to be used for transportation. Gasoline, our cars; diesel, trucks; diesel increasingly in Europe for cars as well, and in other places around the world. Carojet, jet fuel. The planes we fly, and what's referred to as bunkers. This is what fuels the ships. You shut off the flow of oil today to the world, and civilization as we know it will come to an end. It's that simple. We cannot function right now in the world as it is, as infrastructure and the economy is arranged, without oil. It fuels it. It is that important. So what is oil? Well, it's a naturally occurring, non-renewable, complex liquid mixture of hydrocarbons. What is it? Basically, it's black goop with a whole bunch of fuels in it. So the question is, how do you get the fuels out that you need from it? You boil it. Oil has an interesting property. If you boil water, it turns to steam, evaporates. Oil, if you boil it, you'll reach a certain temperature, and one fuel will boil off. First, what we call liquefied petroleum gases, butane, propane, things like that you use for camping. Then it'll stop boiling. Then you take it up another temperature, and another fuel will evaporate and boil off. And you keep going like this through a whole slate of fuels. Gasoline, what we refer to as distillates like diesel, residual fuel oil, which is residual fuel oil and asphalt are basically the bottom of the barrel, the stuff that you have to take to the highest temperature to boil off, and they just seem like black muck. But we found a few uses for the stuff. It gets a little bit more complex than this. I've basically just diagrammed for you an oil refinery here. It gets more complex because A lot of the oil out there gives you too much of the heavy stuff, the residual fuel oil and asphalt that you don't need. So they've come up with techniques to be able to take it and chemically crack the stuff down and turn the heavy stuff into useful products. But this is basically how it works. You boil the oil to get the fuel you need from it. A lot of text here. The basic point I just want to make here is that there's two main indicators of oil quality that you hear that really count. One is what's referred to as the gravity of oil. This is basically the weight, how dense it is, how thick and black it is. The heavier the oil, the more it gives you low quality, heavy fuels, like the residual fuel oil and the asphalt. The lighter it is, the more it gives you the clean transportation fuels that you need that have relatively less pollutants and that are more useful for what we need oil for these days. The other one is sulfur content. It's a key pollutant in there. A lot of crudes out there have a lot of sulfur. It's expensive and difficult to get rid of sulfur, but refineries are geared to be able to do this. The world is increasingly demanding fuels that have less and less sulfur, which means it's more and more expensive and difficult to get the clean fuels that we need. But as far as the price impact goes, you hear a single price frequently quoted for oil. The reality is there's lots of different prices for oil. They use benchmarks, but then what they'll do is if your oil is more heavy or if it's more sour, you refer to the sulfur content of oil by talking about sweet and sour. Sweet has only a little bit of sulfur, sour has a lot. That literally came about in the early days of oil. People would taste the oil, and that's how they referred to it. But if your barrel is more heavy, if your production is more sour, it's going to sell at a discount. Because you have to have the more complex refineries to be able to turn it into the fuels we need. All right, so where is the oil around the world? And here you have to think of it on two levels. Where is the oil production in the world today, and where are the reserves? Where's the oil in the ground? And there's a oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go back here. Okay, so we have to understand the difference between production. There's plenty of oil in the ground right now, and almost all of it is in the Middle East. It's a huge percentage, okay? However, the production of oil in the world today, only about a third of it comes from the Middle East, even though they've got about 2/3 of the oil in the ground, okay? We've got a situation right now where places like, for example, North America, here in the U.S., we're still one of the largest oil producers in the world, even though we consume a lot more than we produce. But we're producing, 18, 19, 20% of the oil in the world, yet we've only got about 5% of the world's oil reserves. So we're in a situation where strategically this can't be kept up forever. A lot of the non-OPEC countries, like the U.S., like Britain and Norway in the North Sea, a lot of West African countries, are producing more oil than they can really sustain in the long run. And the Middle Eastern countries are essentially waiting for the day where production peaks and starts to decline in non-OPEC countries. And that day is coming closer and closer at this point. Okay, and when that happens, they theoretically have the oil in the ground to be able to take advantage of that. All right, that's a bit of a longer term picture. The market itself. Now this is a big difference. Again, you'll hear a lot of news where people will talk about specific incidents or specific issues, and they don't necessarily have the tools to be able to put that into the story of how the market functions on a daily basis. Okay. To do this, you have to sort of start with demand. There's a certain global level of demand for oil out there. How do you fill that? How do you meet that? Well, first you've got basically your base load supplies. Think of it like in an electricity grid. Your nuclear plants run all the time, because they don't swing up and down really easy, so you just run those things full out. Well, that's what non-OPEC countries' oil supplies are like. They run flat out. Whether we're talking the U.S. or Russia or any place like that, they produce everything they can. They are a price taker. They can't impact the price of oil on their own, so they just produce everything they can and try and get everything they can off of the volumes they can produce. You've still got this gap in here. So what does OPEC do? OPEC comes, they fill that gap. They try and get a sense out there, how much oil does the world need beyond what non-OPEC can produce? We're going to come and we're going to fill that gap. Now, statistics are very imprecise when they try and guess what's demand and what's the non-OPEC supply, how much do we need to fill. So what happens is they're always playing a guessing game to try and figure out how much do we need to provide right now. How this shows up for the market on a daily basis, or not so much a daily, but a weekly to a monthly basis, is they get statistics on what oil stocks, inventories are out there, held by companies, held by countries. When those oil stocks are rising, that's a bearish signal to the market. There's too much oil out there, prices should be falling. If those stocks are declining or very low, just the opposite. That's bullish for prices. Prices should be rising. Obviously, prices are very high right now. Part of the reason for that is OPEC has been very successful at keeping stocks low. And this is actually how OPEC works. They realize we need to keep prices low. So they've got a cycle that they've developed over the past half a decade, that allows them to do this. They start out, they send some sort of bullish signal to the market. They talk. You hear about these OPEC meetings every few months. Well, they get together, and if they feel the need to, they'll say something. And there's always a gaggle of journalists behind them trying to figure out, what does this mean, what does that mean? But they'll try and say something that will convince the market that they're planning to keep things tight. As a result of that, the spot price, the price right now on the market, starts to rise. What that does is the futures, it creates a funny situation in the futures curve. The current price becomes higher than the price for, say, next month or 2 months out. That's what we refer to as backwardation. That gives a signal to refiners and the people buying oil. It says, you know what? Oil is going to be cheaper in the future. Therefore, I should wait. I shouldn't buy too much now. I shouldn't build up my stocks of oil now. So refiners are going to minimize the stocks that they keep. The stock levels stay low, and you've created this cycle where OPEC has basically managed to keep stocks low as much as anything. I mean, they've got to act physically as well, but merely through talking, they can keep stocks low and prices high. Last few years, though, they have seen prices go even beyond what they expected. And the reason is you take this cycle, and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of extra factors have converged to drive prices up even higher than they even thought possible. And they thought if prices would reach this level, they might destroy the world economy, and they haven't. What they've seen is all these factors have jumped in. Rising demand in Asia. Chinese demand in the last 2 years has just skyrocketed. Hedge funds. All of a sudden, you've got these commodity exchanges. You might have heard the term NYMEX or IPE. These are big exchanges where people trade futures contracts for oil. And actual prices for oil are often based off of these futures contracts, which are just pieces of paper being traded. Well, all of a sudden, a lot of these hedge funds out there, financial institutions in New York and London and places like this have realized, you know what? Stocks aren't doing so good. Bonds aren't doing so good. Oil prices keep rising. We should get in on this game. So they've jumped in, and just by going in, and they don't understand a lot about the market, they just buy, so they help drive up prices. You've had rising demand for what we refer to as distillate. That's mostly diesel fuel, also heating oil in some parts of the world. And this has basically created a situation where refiners, which are set up to produce more gasoline, can't produce enough of the diesel that's needed. You've had rising tension in the Middle East. Obviously, we've had the war in Iraq. We've had terrorist attacks on infrastructure there. Refiners have been trying to limit their exposure by working just in time. It's a principle that accountants are familiar with. They keep low stocks so that they don't have to bear the cost of that. And at the same time, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, another term you might have heard of, which is basically supposed to be an emergency supply of oil held by the U.S. Well, we've been putting oil into the reserve just as prices are higher. What's the result of that? It's basically like reducing the supply available. So all this stuff has come together and helped OPEC to keep prices higher. Where are prices today in historical context? If you look at the real price, the nominal price here you can see is the blue line, the price you see quoted out there. Well, we're at an all-time high if you look at the series. But if you account for inflation, we're not there. Okay, the price spikes in the 70s and early 80s were much higher, and if you go back to the very early days of oil, oil was much more expensive at that point. However, what you can see here is we are rising here, and I'm going to tell you this right now. That's not likely to come down anytime soon. If anything, it's likely to go up from here. So we're on a trend to be more like some of these past spikes. The thing that has always driven this is fears of whether or not there's going to be sufficient supply. I'll get more into that in a bit, but these are the only two eras in the past, right around the turn of the century as cars were starting to come into more use, and about the time of World War I, where there were fears that we might not have enough supply in the future. They found big discoveries, price came back down again. Well, today we're living in an era where we're not necessarily in a situation where we're going to make a lot of more big discoveries. So this is a trend that's likely only to go up. Even though you'll have some cyclicality, you might have temporary downturns, the trend is up. So let's talk a little bit about the longer term. Demand remains cyclical. You have up downs and downtimes, just like the world economy. But within that, what we're seeing is the rising influence of China. This is every year how much additional demand for oil is there in the world, measured in thousands of barrels per day. So you're about 2 million barrels per day here. Last year we had nearly 3 million barrels per day of new oil demand coming on. We expect it to be a bit more moderate this year, although that forecast has upside, if anything. So demand continues its march. It's up and down, but it's basically kept up an average. If you take it, this is over a decade, and you go back to previous decades and put it in percentage terms, it's very similar with the ups and downs. However, at the same time, we've got supply problems developing now. Prices have been high for several years. When prices are high, the theory is basically oil companies have an incentive to go out and spend money to explore and look for more oil and to drill more in places where they already know there's oil. However, if you take the world outside of OPEC, and then you take out the former Soviet Union, which has been on this big rebound after collapsing production after the fall of the Soviet Union, you take the world outside the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union and OPEC, supplies are basically flat. They've gone pretty much nowhere over the last few years, and they're not expected to do much more either. This is a real shift. Non-OPEC supplies have consistently risen, and when you've looked out in the future beyond the time frame of projects you know about, you've always been able to say there's another big play out there. Well, that's not really happening. And this is the key issue. The market in the long term wants to know how much will demand grow and how much will supplies outside of OPEC grow. If supplies outside of OPEC can grow enough to keep up with demand, we're fine. We're not more dependent on OPEC. The market can function and things don't get tighter. However, this gives us a sign that things are likely to get tighter. All right, so let's get into, you've got sort of that basic understanding of fundamentals. Let's talk a bit about how politics and oil interact. And I want to break this down into three basic categories. Talk about big sort of strategic shifts in the world. It's a broad category. There's many different examples of it. I'll run through a few. Another one is OPEC politics, how OPEC tries to influence the market and how politics within OPEC affect their decisions. And finally, the issue of supply disruptions. Okay, start with strategic shifts. The big one that I think consumers are never likely to forget is what happened in 1973. The Arab oil embargo, and then a bit later in the decade as well when the Iranian Revolution hit and prices rose again. Question, why did the embargo in 1973 work? This was basically a politically driven issue. The U.S. had come out and been seen to support Israel very openly in their war against Egypt and Syria in 1973. Really upset the Arabs. They decided to have a boycott, and prices skyrocketed. Well, they had tried the same thing in 1967 and failed miserably. The question is why? The reason is that before 1973, back in 1967 and prior, OPEC was not the place in the world that held the world's surplus of oil production. It was Texas. So that if supplies got cut off or demand suddenly rose prior to the 70s, and the world suddenly needed some extra oil, Texas could provide it. All right? And obviously the U.S. is going to be acting in consumers' interests. If the world needs extra oil, they would provide it. Well, right about 1970, give or take a couple of years, the U.S. switched. We were no longer an exporter of oil to the world. We became an importer. Because of that, we no longer had the spare capacity in case of emergencies to give the world extra oil. The Middle East did all of a sudden. They had, again, you've seen this big bulge of reserves they have, and even though their production is smaller, it shifted so that they kept extra production beyond what was needed. The U.S. could no longer do that. The Middle East could. When 1973 came around, they had the power to be able to hold back supplies and send prices rising. The result, of course, was gas lines here in the United States. That's from the 70s. Something more recent, let's talk about. One of the main factors behind the rise in prices over the last few years has been a political shift in the Middle East as well. The neoconservatives, the folks who brought you the war in Iraq, had this notion that they could effect a big strategic change in the Middle East that would be beneficial to U.S. interests, including supposedly secure oil supplies. Okay? The idea is you knock off Iraq, you create a change in the region, all of a sudden this Turkish-Israeli alliance that was built in the 90s, you add Iraq to it, and all of a sudden all these states in the region that are supposedly troublemakers fall into line, and you've got a more stable region that's more beneficent towards U.S. interests as a result. The idea was sort of this domino effect idea familiar from the Cold War. It backfired. The neocons got it wrong. What happens is the U.S. policy jumps into the region and starts trying to be very proactive in pushing some of these goals by military force, by overt pressures that nobody takes very kindly to, and it exacerbates regional tensions. You know, you have ethnic minorities getting upset, you have terrorists and al-Qaeda growing influence and ability to attack oil infrastructure or places that raise fears of attacks on oil infrastructure. And what does this do? It creates support for oil prices. When markets see potential supply disruptions, they get nervous. And that has been one of the factors underpinning the rise in oil prices. As a result of this, more money flows to the existing regimes. They're safer than ever. They're able to pursue their own interests because their domestic finances are secured, and when their domestic finances are secured, they can keep their constituents happy. As long as they can do that, they're strong, and oil prices don't go down as a result of that. So U.S. policy in this sense backfired. What's coming up? I think there's two really important strategic shifts that we're already starting to see and that we're going to see more of and that have important political implications. The first one I want to talk about is China. Chinese demand has suddenly really taken off. You can see after being flat in the early 80s, some of the economic opening helped them increase their growth rates through here, and all of a sudden in the last 3 years or so, it's just really jumped to a whole new level. We've seen this before in Asia. If you look at the history of oil demand in Japan and Korea as they really entered their high growth phases, they maintained for a decade sometimes 20% growth in oil demand every single year. Now, if you were to see 20% oil demand growth in China every single year for a decade, I guarantee you we would not be able to produce enough oil as we need. It's probably not going to be that drastic. Even in the highest growth periods here, we've seen more like 15%, 10 to 15%. But that's huge. In a country on China's scale, that is absolutely massive. In Korea, if you had a situation where you had 20% growth, well, that's okay. You need to build one big refinery a year. You do 20% growth in China, you need to build 10 per year. I mean, the billions of dollars of investment that are required are just astonishing to think about. So this is a huge shift in the oil market. All of a sudden, they're having to feed China more and more. People are having to compete more and more with China. It really tightens the demand picture and ensures higher demand, at least in the medium term, while China really jumps up in this stage of its growth. It also raises sort of old supply security fears. Now, you hear this talked about a lot as well. The U.S. and Japan in particular will talk a lot about how we need to secure supplies. China's this big competitor. We need to make sure we have enough oil. Well, you're always going to have enough oil. It's just a question of how the oil flows work. The issue that's more important here is China has these similar fears, and so what are they doing? They're taking their big national oil companies and they're telling them, go out in the world, we've basically got 3 million barrels a day of production, we consume 6 or 7 million right now and it's growing. I want you to go out in the world, Chinese oil company number one, CNOOC, CNPC, whatever, find places where you can produce oil and lock in a long-term contract where we know those supplies are securely coming to us. Again, it's mostly just a matter of flows because there's oil out there, it will flow to where it needs to ultimately, but what this does is if you lock in a long-term contract like that, there's less oil available on the spot market. What's traded just freely, people buy it at whatever price the market says it's available at because you're putting more of it into these long-term contracts, and when you do that and you've got less liquidity on the spot market, well, more people are chasing after the same barrel. And so even though the overall global balance doesn't change, on the spot market where prices are set, things are tighter there, and that creates upward pressure on prices. Okay. The other implication here is that more countries are going to look to China for a strategic partnership. I'm thinking specifically here of the Gulf oil exporters. I mean, it's true globally, but the Gulf oil exporters in particular are happy about this. These exporters have already been very upset by U.S. foreign policy in the region. The thing you always hear when you talk about the Saudis is, they'll always complain about American support for Israel over the Palestinians. They'll complain about the Iraq war messing things up, and they'll complain about the fact that after 9/11 there's this rift, and even though we've always been friends, now we can't get visas to come to the United States. So a lot of the love that was there has been lost as a result, and the U.S. is looked upon now more as a rogue state, a dangerous state that you don't know what they're going to do. They're unpredictable. They'll go and invade countries. We need to find somebody we can rely on more who's not going to say, you guys need to change and we'll overthrow you by force of arms if you don't. China fits the bill very nicely. They realize they can't rely on China for military protection, not at this stage in any case. But what they're looking to do is create a broad arrangement of new relationships, diplomatic, economic, political, so that they can create stronger ties there with the rising power. The basic thing you might say is, well, we're going to send you oil, you'll send us the money. That's it at its most basic level. But the reality is they're seeking to do something much more with the relationship than just that. There are places in the Middle East that are looking actually to strengthen relationships with the United States. Algeria and Libya, as big oil producers, come to mind. They see it more in their interest to be able to be cooperative, both with Europe, but also because they feel like they can stabilize their own regimes by having a security relationship with the United States. We're very fond of giving people guns and weapons if they'll fight Al-Qaeda for us. It strengthens their own domestic position, their ability to hold back domestic opposition forces. However, for the oil markets, it doesn't matter as much. Basically, these guys have no spare capacity. Again, like Texas ran out of spare capacity, these guys, they're raising their production, but they're just producing all they've got. So they don't have the ability to swing and influence the market the way Saudi Arabia does. The next strategic shift. I mentioned it briefly here. Non-OPEC oil supplies at this point are nearing their peak. This has a lot of important implications. Again, in the past, when you did long-term oil supply forecasting, you could frequently look out about 5 years and say, okay, I know the projects that are scheduled to come online, companies that give in press releases, we can follow this and say, and after that, things always looked like they were going to drop off here. Looks a lot like this graph. But at the same time, back then, everybody always knew, well, but there's another big play coming. We can see, the North Sea can come online. Russia can do a lot more. Things like this. Well, we can see that sort of time frame 5 years out right now. We can see those big plays, but unlike the past, there's nothing new on the horizon after that this time. There's no big, undeveloped resource outside of OPEC that the world can turn to for supplies. And we can talk a lot about saying, okay, we should, build up production in West Africa and Central Asia, but ultimately all that's going to do is give you this little bump here. After that, nobody sees anything. And what's more is, what you would really look to rely on here is increasing success rates in exploration. The reality is almost every single decade, the amount of new oil discovered has been cut in half globally from the decade before. So we're finding less oil, we're consuming more oil, and non-OPEC looks like now by about the early to middle part of next decade, it's peaked. This has got a lot of implications. For OPEC, traditionally, the thought was this should be good news for us because when non-OPEC runs out, hey, we get to reap the benefits. We've got these huge reserves. We'll bring them online. We'll make even more money. Everything will be great. But OPEC has now realized, actually, this is a big problem for us because when this peak comes, if demand keeps going the way it has been, just sort of on trend, I mean, you take out the peaks and troughs and take an average and try and figure out where things are trending, then when this non-OPEC supply reaches its peak and declines, all of a sudden, very, very quickly, we're going to have to provide a lot more oil. And we can't bring it online instantly. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of materials. We can't bring it on that fast. The result is a big gap opens up here. That gap is a gap we should all be very scared of. That's the gap that could give you $100, $200, $300 a barrel oil instead of 40 or 50 like we've got right now. You think $2 gasoline's expensive, well, wait till you see $20 or $30 gasoline. That's dangerous. It's so dangerous, in fact, it would send the world economy into deep depression. It would essentially make oil worthless because when oil prices are that high, anything else will be viable. Just you can come up with any other form of energy, it will be cheaper than oil. But everybody will suffer in the process. Consumers will suffer, the economy will be devastated for years, and the producers will suffer because consumers will find some other source at that point, even if it's not as cheap and even if it forces the economy to find more expensive forms of energy, but they won't be using oil anymore. So OPEC realizes this is actually not so good for us. We don't like this. This is dangerous for us. There are solutions, though, practically achievable ones. If you increase conservation, you slow down the rate of demand growth. You bring that red line, the pace of its increases, down so that there's less supply OPEC has to meet. At the same time, you can increase what's called unconventional oils. I'll talk a bit more about that. So you bring up the supply at the same time you're bringing down the demand, and what happens is the world, if it's managed right, remains dependent on, say, 10 to 15 million barrels a day of Saudi oil. Right now they produce about 9, but they remain dependent on 10 to 15 million barrels a day of Saudi oil instead of 20 to 30. 20 to 30 million barrels a day of oil, even though technically speaking Saudi could do it, they realize they don't have the resources to bring it on at the right time. It kills them. And again, this completely changes the strategic and political map of the world. All of a sudden, the Middle East just doesn't matter anymore the way it does now. They don't want that. That's not good for them. As a result, they're trying to avoid it. There are solutions here. The one thing that gets mentioned sometimes is this idea of the hydrogen economy, this huge energy paradigm shift, and the idea that we can completely get off oil. Obviously, that's bad for OPEC as well. Okay, this is why they want to be able to keep the world dependent on a level of oil they can maintain. It's good for them. If the world actually shifts to something else like hydrogen, then they're in trouble. However, good news for them, hydrogen looks like it's pretty much a mirage. You can, technically speaking, create a car that can run on it. The technology is improving. It'll get to the point, theoretically, where it could be viable. The problem is, where are you going to get the hydrogen? People talk about it. It's the most abundant thing in the world, you know, every water molecule. But the problem is, you've got to get the hydrogen out of those molecules. And there's no economic way to do it right now. Hydrogen is a very expensive fuel, and there's no cheap, non-polluting way to get it. At least to get sufficient volumes of it. So again, OPEC sees benefits in this, and consumers, lacking any other option to totally shift the way we do energy, it's ultimately good for us until we can find that shift. It will happen eventually, but it's not there yet. So for OPEC, they've discovered they can sort of take their old tools for managing prices, and they can use it to extend the age of oil. Okay. They'll keep very thin spare capacity. When there's not a lot of excess capacity available for emergencies, the world gets nervous, prices stay a bit higher. When you do that, prices will rise. But as we've seen, prices have come to levels that people just thought would be untenable and send the world into recession. Well, guess what? The world turns out it can manage it. So they rise enough to then induce some demand destruction, some conservation. You know, people start driving more hybrids and things like that, and then makes a difference in the long run. And we get some more alternative oils. Again, I'll get to that in just a minute. So you impact the demand and the supply side, and the balance keeps the world reliant on a manageable amount of Saudi oil. Age of oil is extended. All right. Can politicians do this, though? Can they get to the point where they can implement the policies that will allow these things to happen? Okay. Can they reduce demand? Well, hybrid vehicles actually can do a lot. Not in the short term. You know, in the 80s when prices suddenly went very high, well, technologically it was easy. You buy a little car from Toyota imported from Japan instead of the big Oldsmobile boat. That was quick, that was easy, it really saved a lot of oil. Hybrid vehicles will take longer. It's more expensive, it's technologically complex, you have to build a whole infrastructure for repairs. But it holds the potential to save a lot of oil and really slow down oil demand growth. Again, hydrogen's something of a mirage here. New supplies. You've got limited, again, conventional supply options. This is what I was talking about, the non-OPEC oil supplies peaking. You know, people can talk a bit about Anwar and that being a big field. Sure, yeah, but ultimately for the long-term picture, it's a blip. It would matter and help a little bit in the short term, but not for the long term that much. It's the unconventional oils, again, I'll get to in just a sec, that really hold the promise, and the high prices allow types of oil that were previously expensive to produce to become viable. So can we have, obviously we'll have the price incentive, but will governments do what it takes to be able to spur these things on to make sure the balance stays more beneficial to us as consumers as opposed to producers? And these are global issues. You know, politics in China matter just as much as they do in the US here, or Europe, or Brazil. You know, if China as a developing country says, you know what, we've only got a few people driving cars right now, if we require from this moment on that everybody who does buy a car as we get wealthier buys a hybrid, that has a big impact. It really slows down the level of oil demand growth as more people in China become wealthy enough to purchase a car. Okay, and this matters in a lot of different places around the world. All right. I think I got a couple slides slightly out of order here, but this is the unconventional oils I was talking about. Conventional oil reserves are spoken of as basically sort of standard within a certain range of gravity, a certain weight that's manageable and easily refinable to turn into oil. There's another one that we refer to as bitumen, or sometimes referred to as tar sands in Canada. In Canada and Venezuela alone, those two countries have more of this really extra heavy, gooey muck available in reserves than all the conventional oil reserves in the world. There are huge, huge amounts of it, but it is extremely expensive to produce. It takes billions of dollars of investment. It takes lots and lots of natural resources to produce. It's polluting, so you have to have anti-pollution measures. These are difficult things. It was seen as they finally managed to get some technologies up where it was barely economically viable to produce it. Well, at these prices now, suddenly it becomes much more attractive. And as companies look around and say, you know, we don't have nearly as many options to be able to produce conventional oil, we're just not finding the stuff, all of a sudden, even though the stuff is more expensive, well, at these prices, it's still quite profitable. It moves up your choice of investments that you might put money into. And we're already seeing that in Canada. It's slow. It can't be enough to replace conventional oil because it takes so long and so much money to put in, but it can have a very important effect on slowing down the declines in non-OPEC growth, and again, narrowing that gap that we fear coming between supplies and demand. Another very promising technology is what's referred to as GTL, gas to liquids. Oil is easy to move around. Get it out of the ground, stick it in a tanker, stick it in a barrel, stick it in a pipeline. You can get it to where you need it just about anywhere in the world. Natural gas is much more difficult. It's just the physical properties. It's gas. You got to keep it under pressure. You got to keep it bottled up. So it's much more difficult to do that with. What they've figured out now is they actually have a chemical process that they can take natural gas and turn it into clean transportation fuels. It's a technology that's just barely starting to become commercially viable. You have, though, huge amounts of stranded gas reserves around the world, places where they said we just can't develop this economically. It's too far away from consumption. It would be too expensive to get it there. Those gas reserves now could become viable. If you get one of these little GTL factories, you drop it down in a gas field somewhere, you produce liquids, and then the liquids are easy to move. Okay? Qatar in the Gulf is a pioneer here. You've had some plants around the world in South Africa and Malaysia that have been producing this in small volumes for quite some time now. Qatar is the first one that's really taking the leap. They've got the world's largest single gas field offshore in Qatar, and they're going to be taking this and trying to turn it over the next decade or so into about 1 million barrels a day of this GTL production. And if they do this, and it's commercially viable, and I suspect it will be, all of a sudden you're going to have the technology and you'll have it basically canned and prepackaged and ready to go, where other places, again, sort of South Africa, West Africa, where they just right now just burn off a lot of the natural gas that's produced when they're producing oil, all of a sudden you can produce a lot more GTL, and Russia has absolutely massive reserves, along with Iran, of natural gas that could be turned into usable liquids. And finally, biofuels. You hear about ethanol in the United States. The farmers like this. It's basically a government subsidy that allows them to turn corn and wheat and sugarcane and things like that into usable fuels. Small amounts right now in Brazil, Europe, and the U.S. being produced of this stuff. It's ultimately not necessarily that friendly for the environment, despite what they say about it being a renewable resource. It does cause a fair amount of pollution. However, it can add to the supply picture at the same time and be another sliver along with some of the GTLs and the vitamins and likely some other things we don't see right now. All of this can sort of add together and be very useful. Okay, let's get into OPEC politics a bit here. OPEC is frequently referred to as a cartel. Everybody, every few months you hear about somebody in the U.S. trying to sue them for breaking U.S. antitrust laws, things like this, but they're nothing new. The oil market, when it first started out, was extremely volatile. You might remember that first graph, or that graph I showed you of historical oil prices, and if you go back to the early era of oil, prices were jumping all over the place. It was very, very volatile. And from the earliest days, people tried to basically say, you know what, we got a lot of oil out here. Let's constrain our production so that prices don't jump all over the place and basically destroy investment and destroy the chance to have a stable industry here. Okay, so John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s were the first ones who tried to do this. He was quite successful at doing this in the United States. He basically bought up all the companies and said, we're going to set the price the way we want it. He was challenged outside the United States because there were large amounts of production coming on around the world, but it made prices relatively more stable. Okay, as they found more supplies and Standard Oil Trust was broken up and the ability to have this monopoly power on the part of companies weakened, you had a situation where, again, prices began to collapse. They made a huge discovery in Texas right at the start of the Great Depression. Everybody looking for some money goes down there, and they just produce massive amounts of oil and turn it to like 10 cents a barrel. I mean, just ridiculously cheap, even by the standards of a little bureaucratic agency in Texas known as the Texas Railroad Commission got empowered to limit production. Basically say, you've got a quota. Back again. So the Texas Railroad Commission really becomes the first formal organization that is a model for OPEC. They deliberately limit production. Now, they try to create a price that's stable because they're trying to create a market for oil. They've got all this oil. They want consumers to consume it. So they're acting mostly in the consumer's interest to say, okay, we need to keep the industry developing, but we need prices low enough so that people can, drive their new cars after World War II and everybody feels comfortable with this. And they acted mostly in consumers' interests in that sense. trying to keep a balance. Obviously, the United States was the world's largest producer at the time. By around 1970, when their power was lost, they ran out of their spare production capacity because demand had risen so much in the United States. OPEC again starts to look around and realize, even before Texas had lost its status as the world's swing producer, the OPEC countries look around and realize we're going to be in that position eventually. They looked at the Texas Railroad Commission and said, we can do the same thing, but we can act in our interests as opposed to the consumer's interests. You know, we're poor countries, we're developing, we need the money. Let's act we don't want to send prices so high that we'll kill demand, but let's act so that we can get more revenues and so that these Western companies that are here aren't the ones getting all the benefit from the oil. Okay, so the key lessons here, I think, to realize are the fact that you've got a surplus of reserves out in the world convinces producers that they need to unite to restrain production. Where that surplus is located really determines what the prices are going to be because of what the political goals of whatever that cartel are going to be. Texas Railroad Commission acted in a different set of interests than OPEC did. That cartel is still subject to broader fundamentals. When OPEC sent prices skyrocketing in the late 70s, well, guess what? Demand collapsed and their production collapsed as a result. So they don't have carte blanche to do whatever they want. They've still got to deal in a broader oil market, but they have a lot of power here. The cartel can tighten the market either by pulling in their production in the short term, saying, you know what, there's going to be less demand next quarter than there is just because of weather patterns, so we're going to pull in our production. So they can try and keep prices up that way. Or for the longer term, they can say, you know what, we don't want to have a lot of spare capacity. If there's a lot of spare capacity, nobody's going to be scared about things blowing up around in the world, and prices will come down because everyone will say, well, we know the Saudis can produce more if we need it. So by keeping thinner spare capacity, they can help keep prices higher in the long term. And that's what's happened here. This is basically the capacity level OPEC built in the 70s. We're now back to it. Production is there again. They basically built no new spare capacity, or only a little bit in the interim, so they've allowed spare capacity to get very thin again. It's very important here then to understand the politics of OPEC countries. These countries are what we refer to as rentier states. Their economies, for the most part, don't produce any new value. They suck oil out of the ground, they sell it, money comes in the system from the top, and then the rulers just basically spread the money down from there. Because of that, these countries have basically become dependent on oil as a resource. And the government's budget, the entire national economy is dependent on swings in oil prices. Their goal is obviously to maximize revenues to feed growing underdeveloped countries. And in that process, the countries within OPEC who have the most spare capacity, who can swing production the most to match what demand is doing, have the greatest power. What does that mean? That means Saudi Arabia. They by far have the most spare capacity. They're the ultimate arbiter of decisions within OPEC. So what happens in Saudi Arabia, in domestic Saudi politics, in U.S.-Saudi relations, in Saudi relations with the rest of the world, matter a lot. In fact, we can see this in the prices over the last decade. Security and strategic issues will frequently intervene in this. In the early 90s, we had a situation after what we call the first Gulf War, what in the Middle East they call the second Gulf War, the Iran-Iraq War being the first Gulf War to them. But after the Gulf War in 1991, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia had basically decided we are going to have a very tight relationship with the United States. It'll be a straight-up cheap oil for security relationship. He pursued that interest at all expenses. Oil prices stayed low. However, it wrecked the finances of the kingdom. Absolutely devastated them. Saudi Arabia became a net debtor. They were in debt after having been this great oil superpower. Well, by the mid-1990s, King Fahd gets sick. The crown prince, a man by the name of Abdullah, realizes we got to do something to fix this. We can't act just for the Americans. We've got to act in our own interests, or otherwise we sink ourselves. So he starts looking around the region and says, you know what? We can be friends with Iran. They've elected this nice guy Khatami. They've got practical guys. Now that Khomeini's dead, we can deal with them. At the same time, halfway across the world in Venezuela, one of the Saudis' chief competitors for oil markets in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico region, because they had a lot of the same really heavy, low-quality oil they both sold to there. Venezuela for a long time had been the big cheater, overproducing in OPEC and sending a lot of oil and really hurting the Saudi strategy. Well, Hugo Chavez comes to power in Venezuela. He's a populist. He says, you know what? We're not going to flood this market. This hurts us. We can make more money if we restrain our production here. We shouldn't, again, Chavez basically saying, we're not going to act for the Americans' interest. I think my interest is in getting more money now to fuel my Bolivarian revolution. So all of this stuff comes together, and all of a sudden OPEC can keep prices high. The U.S.-Saudi divorce is complete. We no longer have a strategic relationship. We're not on, we're not enemies, but, we're not friends the way we once were. And the Saudi state at the same time is changing. If you look at the 1990s and how it was under Fahd, well, again, the basic idea is oil money comes in the top, goes to the royal family. They pass it down to society, who acquiesces to their rule. You need security? Okay, get a few foreign mercenaries in. You need people to do the dirty work you don't like to do? Okay, get some Filipinos and Pakistanis and get these guys to come in and do the work for you. Everybody's happy, right? Except for, well, it turns out that causes some problems. You're dependent on the Americans, and people don't like the Americans anymore. The Americans support the Israelis killing Palestinians. They invade Iraq. You know, they do all this nasty stuff. They call us bad names after 9/11. So this isn't very tenable anymore. At the same time, oh, well, we've got money, but our people still need to work. They're unemployed, and they're running off and joining, Al-Qaeda and doing stuff like this and undermining our security. We got to do something to get more Saudis to work, and all these foreign laborers, well, we got to let a few of them go. So they start a program called Saudiization to get more Saudis working. So the question is, okay, so what's a new model? How can we work and create a new situation? How can we basically develop more towards being a normal state and not this rentier state that's totally dependent on oil? Well, let's create more of a normal relationship between us and our people. Okay, the money's still coming in, that's vital. But let's ask a little bit of our people. Let's be like a normal country where, people have to pay some taxes, they got to do something for the state. They won't like that if we don't give them something in return. So, all right, let's give them some real security. Let's have more sustainable international alliances so they're not angry at what the royals are doing with the Americans. Let's bring in some investment. Let's have laws people trust in. Develop along these lines. And then we've got a situation that's more sustainable for the long run. Okay? And again, this very much depends on, as you're trying to make this change to have some taxes and things like this, well, you still need the money coming in to fuel the change. If you just cut it off, you can't do this. It's too painful, you cause too much social upheaval, and the whole house of cards falls down. But as long as the money's coming in, it works. So let's keep the prices up. And by the way, the Americans are helping us by keeping oil markets tense over things blowing up in Iraq and stuff like this. So again, developments inside Saudi Arabia really matter for the ultimate oil price. Finally, last thing I want to talk about is probably the thing that hits the headlines the most when we talk about oil markets, which is supply disruptions, things blowing up around the world. This is something that has a short-term market impact more than anything, but it really can roil oil markets. And when you're living in a world that has very little spare production capacity, the impact of some supply being lost somewhere is much bigger on the market. Prices will jump much more when you know you've only got a little bit of excess in case of an emergency than when you've got a lot of excess. So besides for actually losing supplies, you actually reduce average supply over the course of the year, because you got to expect you're going to have a certain number of supply disruptions throughout the year. You never know where they're going to be precisely, but they're going to happen. Besides for that, you also had a fear premium to prices. This can happen at any time. Things are boiling in politics in this country or that. So as a result of that, the market's going to price in some tension. They'll just keep prices a little bit higher than just fundamentals on their own would justify, because they know something's going to happen at some point. Disruptions can come in multiple flavors. You have political things. In Iraq, you've got the war going on, the insurgency, people blowing up pipelines. In Venezuela, late 2002, early 2003, you had the strike of the oil company PDVSA, basically trying to cut off Chavez's source of revenues, cut off supplies. Russia, politics with the oligarchs there. Nigeria. Weather can have its say. Hurricanes happen. Labor disputes. Oil workers go on strikes. The greatest political supply risks out there right now, and these are the sorts of things that you can say are almost always priced in, is what's happening in Iraq and what's happening in Nigeria. You can see over the course of last year as well, these are all places where we've had supply disruptions or threats of supply disruption. So this is a frequent occurrence. Okay. And the current round of price increases basically got kicked off when we had, again, Iraq and Nigeria and Venezuela lose production in early 2002, early 2003. The Iraqi production was the result of the war. Iraqi production basically went offline for several months and took almost a year to come fully back online, and even now it's not really fully back online. Nigeria, you had some disruptions there, and Venezuela as well, due to the strike. In Iraq, where's the risks? Just to give you an idea of one country where we have to watch things frequently and know what's going on the ground to be able to really understand how it impacts the market. Well, Iraq's sort of two oil countries. You've got a northern country and a southern country. There's two fields that matter, the Kirkuk field and the Rumaila field in the south. Kirkuk produces about 20% of the country's oil. It goes out, it's exported up through Turkey to the Mediterranean. Rumaila is exported through the Persian Gulf, near the port of Basra, down there. Obviously the north, this is a place where the insurgency rages much hotter. And the insurgents have essentially managed to shut down production here. You get a trickle here and then, that's it. In the south, you get occasional attacks. It's occasionally shut off oil. It's more effective when it happens here. You cut off a lot more oil to the market. 1.8 million barrels a day can go down if you effectively shut down the South, or 1.5 million barrels a day. Huge amount of oil for the market. Again, when you're talking about annual growth in oil demand being about 2 million barrels per day, well, you can knock almost that much off from one field here if you hit the right pipeline. It's temporary, but it'll really shock the market in the short term at least. So it's vulnerable in the South. And these are the sorts of things we have to keep an eye on. We know this is going to stay down. Well, what's going to happen here? What's happening in local politics? Who are the political forces down there? Who needs to be watched? Who are the Baathists likely to head down there and strike in the South where it's a less inviting environment or not? Nigeria. This is an example. Nigeria's always got a problem with strikes. Everybody always wants to go on strike in Nigeria. Occasionally that causes a supply disruption. Nigeria is important because they're a key supplier of the really high-quality crudes, and they can swing between the Atlantic and Pacific basins. If China needs it or the U.S. needs it more, they can do that. That can happen there. But the other problem in Nigeria is it's concentrated in this delta area here. Escravos, Forcados, Brass River, Port Harcourt, or Bonny, these are the main oil export terminals. And you've got this mishmash of little ethnic groups down there who've got all sorts of tensions, fights over how they're going to control oil, who gets the oil resources. Nigeria has become poorer since oil was discovered, not richer, which is a frequent occurrence because the money tends to get wasted in these places under corruption. And so these ethnic groups are constantly fighting over it, and they're willing to shut down production to make a point. And finally, weather gets its say. Hurricane Ivan last year heads straight for the Gulf, hits right all the oil production right around here. This gives you an idea what it can do. Totally just destroyed oil platforms. So those are basically the sorts of production knockouts you can have. And I think I've gone quite long as I was afraid I might. But if anybody wants to ask any questions or stay, I'm happy to answer.